Today is about, there we go, there's the friendly lady. Today's conversation is about shaping this pathway towards collaborative action for a climate resilient cotton sector. And this is our third roundtable. So those of you who have joined one of the previous two will know that we've been covering climate adaptation and climate change in some detail. And we're really taking as a premise for our starting point today that adaptation to climate change is absolutely urgent, and that the sector will need to build resilience starting now, and that we have to really take a deep and critical look at how the current system is structured and what needs to change in order for cotton to be resilient in the future. Of course, along with any other agricultural commodity facing really deep and grave changes due to climate change and all the social pressures that will come with it. So in this session, we're really trying to understand within that really difficult context what good looks like. If we could just go back to the previous slide, we're going to share with you some ideas for initiatives and get your feedback on them to kind of really work up this picture of what good could look like in an adaptation response. Next slide, please. So we are at Forum for the Future. Forum for the Future is a sustainability NGO with offices around the world. And our focus is on systems change and using futures and systems change as a tool to really leverage complex global challenges. And we work across a range of sectors and industries. And in this, if we go to the last slide, please. We're partnering in this initiative with Willis Towers Watson, who's a climate risk agency and global advisory. And they have developed with us the climate resilience risk assessment tool that mapped out the climate change risks in cotton. Next slide, please. So for those of you who don't know Cotton 2040, it's a collaborative multi-stakeholder initiative we've been running for about 5 years. And our focus has been on working with existing industry initiatives that are already actively working for change in cotton. And some of you are on the call today, really nice to see you. And through working in partnership, aligning around those areas where our joint work can really have critical impact, particularly with regard to the big challenges that we see on the horizon. And in particular, this session is about climate change. We have other work streams that are working on questions around business models and increasing uptake of sustainable cotton. But all of them are really looking at how we can help cotton develop the resilience so that it can thrive in a world that is increasingly disrupted and going to grow ever more so. Next slide, please. And we are really fortunate to have a whole range of organizations as partners in Cotton 2040. And you can see their logos on this slide. We partner in particular with the range of sustainable cotton standards and codes, brands, trade organizations, and we're particularly grateful to our sponsor partner, Zalando and Loudest Foundation, that has made this work possible. Next slide, please. So many of you, I hope, will have seen the reports that were brought out earlier, well, I was going to say earlier this year, in 2021, that took the first global risk assessment of cotton in relation to climate change. And these were the first reports of its kind to really give a global picture of what cotton production is likely to be like in 2040 on the pathway that we are currently on. And we have a global report and then a very specific India report that goes into India's production in greater detail. And this was published with Acclimatize and Willis Towers Watson last year. And you can find the detail in the report or in the microsite that lets you work interactively with that data and explore what that might mean in particular regions and under particular conditions. Next slide, please. So in the previous two workshops, we've been working through the implications of climate change to cotton and the risks that might involve. So what you see here is what came out collectively from the conversations that we've had. And you can see that we looked at different risks across the cotton sector that were mapped out in the climate change report and in the microsite, and then drilled down deeper to think about what might that mean on the ground. So we might have heat stress and extreme heat, for example, in the top left-hand corner. And obviously there are decreases in crop production, but it would also lead to health and safety concerns to the workforce. It might also contribute to decreases in machine efficiency. And all across these different risks, we've really tried to think systemically and join the dots to get a picture of what these risks are likely to mean for cotton production. And this has really informed our approach going forward as we think about, all right, what kinds of mitigation, what kinds of adaptation responses would be needed to respond to this broad set of really interconnected risks facing the industry. If we go to the next slide. We've had a series of these 3 conversations, and today's, as I mentioned before, is really about saying, out of our understanding of what the risks are likely to be, out of our understanding of what the implications are for the cotton sector, what is the most important thing to do? Because there is no shortage of needs, and the challenge is really urgent and to be honest, quite overwhelming when you think about where to start. But we're wanting to get a clearer sense of what the really powerful points to begin would be, and where you see most feasibility and greatest potential for transformation. If we go to the next slide. So today, we're going to think really critically about those interventions. We're going to ask you at the end, I'm giving you a heads up about that now, whether the innovations that we're going to propose to you are disruptive, because we know that we're not just looking to refine and kind of tweak a current system, but whether they're really going to create a pathway for a new system to emerge. If they're innovative, we need something that's really very, very different and in most cases radical. So innovation is required. And whether they have potential to transform the cotton system. And we're really wanting to look at what would it mean to move some of these ideas from theory, because some of them don't really exist yet, or are still in conceptual stage, or might have been applied in other industries but may not be working in cotton. What does it mean to move that from theory into practice? And then really looking at how different actors across the supply chain could work on this together. Next slide, please. So what we're going to be doing is, in a moment, I'm going to hand you over to Dhaval, who's going to take you through a review of the different adaptation responses that we discussed in the previous roundtable. And then we'll have some breakout sessions to explore what that might look like as we move towards effective action. We'll come back for a plenary discussion, and then we will finish with a review of what next steps might look like. And we'll finish at 10 to 6 GMT. So I think before I hand you over to Dhaval, I want to speak just to the next slide, please, to share some of the work that's come out of previous versions of Cotton 2040. If we can have the slide with the just and regenerative framework, I'd like to just briefly talk that through. Through the work that we've been doing in Cotton 2040, and particularly in our business models work, as well as in the climate adaptation work, we've been doing a lot of thinking together with our partners in the industry about what would a cotton system look like if it were just regenerative and resilient. And so the points that you see on this framework have come out of consultation with our various working groups. They've come out of a series of workshops that we've had with farmers, brands, traders, other actors across the supply chain in various regions from Africa, North America, Europe, and India. So this is a consolidation of a few years of work and a lot of conversations. And I just want to highlight a few qualities that we see as really key to the cotton industry becoming just, regenerative, and resilient. The first one at the top, you can see that production environments are regenerating and replenishing. And this is really key because we, in the past, when we talked about sustainability, it was a future state where we would be able to continue to produce and to thrive within planetary boundaries. But the way we've exceeded planetary boundaries now, we can see that unless we replenish and regenerate, we won't be able to work sustainably. So we're looking at a system where production environments are regenerating, and also that resources that are used across the supply chain do not contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. We're seeing cotton supply chains that are circular with no or minimal waste. That means we've got circularity technology, reuse methods, longer lifespan of items, all the different aspects that come under circularity to really build that regenerative aspect of a cotton supply chain. Looking at the just aspect, this is the social aspect of justice and equity. This would mean that producers and workers have thriving living wages and livelihoods. It means that producers and workers have agency and voice in the decisions that are impacting them. And really critically, that data becomes what we're calling a force for good. That means that it's used responsibly, it's available to actors, and it's something that everyone can use to drive the change in the ways that are most needed. And this is all happening in a context, bearing in mind, of an industry and a world that is having more and more disruption, more and more extreme weather events, social pressures, competition for scarce resources. So we need mechanisms in place so that everyone in the value chain is more able to cope with shocks and adapt to that disruption. And that's no small ask. That's going to put a lot of stress on society and all the actors in the cotton system to cope with the kind of disruptions that we've been exploring in the previous workshops. And then finally, that support is in place for a just transition to adapt and reform. And bearing in mind there that in some cases, it may not be possible to continue to grow cotton or not to grow it in the same way. People's livelihoods in some cases will be changed or lost. Certain sectors of the industry may need to relocate or work in different ways. And we need to think about how we make that transition so that we minimize the damage and really take care that we make that transition as just as it possibly can. So this is the quality, the vision for the cotton industry that we're thinking about climate adaptation around. And I'm going to hand over to Dhaval to talk about what some of those responses might look like. Dhaval.
Thank you so much, Charlene. So if you go to the next slide, please. What I want to do here is just take a few minutes to to share some of the responses that have been emerging from the earlier two roundtables, and I think this would be really helpful before we break out into groups and start discuss about some of the potential collaborative actions that we want to examine through the lenses that Charlene has just shared. So you don't need to sort of read what's in this. It's a graphic that I can help sort of make you a sense of it. What we have here is we've grouped the various responses that we've heard in a matrix where the rows that you see are different parts of the value chain. So starting with farmers at the top, we then have processing industries, traders, brands and retailers, and consumers at the bottom. And then in the columns, we have the various categories of adaptation responses So starting from, we have informational um, informational responses. So it could be in terms of how do we connect consumers to farmers to drive some of the changes that are required. There were responses that emerged in terms of institutional. So, for example, if water stress is going to become a major issue in a region, how do we manage water not just at the farm level but at a landscape level? And those are some of the kinds of responses that we would need to adapt to climate change. We had quite a few responses that were suggested around contracting and insurance, and how do we share risk that would emerge from some of the climatic impacts across different parts of the value chain. Currently, it is often um, the burden often falls on one or couple of parts of the value chain. Then we had a range of responses required in terms of capacity building, not just at the farmers level, but across different parts of the value chain, maybe in terms of how do we manage soil, what are the different sort of different things that maybe brands or retailers need to do to build capacity across the value chain. So there were a bunch of responses that suggested there. There were several responses suggested in terms of finance. So how could we uh, tailor financial incentives, for example, for farmers, uh, for more regenerative practices that help adapt to climate change. For example, looking at how do we change KPIs and interest rates that are connected to that. So again, there were a bunch of responses around finance that were suggested as well. Then there were typical responses around operational and physical modification that you would expect when you talk about climate adaptation. So, for example, uh, for example, some of the things around precision farming and those kinds of things which would ensure a more efficient use of inputs and decrease costs to address some of the risks that come with climate change. And there were a bunch of responses around sort of the social category in terms of addressing some of the gaps around gender, uh, around 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 economic inequalities, and how that that really helps build the adaptive capacity of various actors in the value chain, which ultimately helps in sort of adapt to climate change. So there were a bunch of responses that sort of emerged from the two roundtables, and what I want to highlight here, without sort of going into detail into any specific sort of response that was suggested, is if you just see the graphic as it is, one thing that seems pretty clear is, and that's again typical when we think about adaptation in a normal way, is there are a lot of interventions that are being suggested or thought about at the farm level. And critical as it is, and because some of the impacts are really going to be felt at that local level, and the vulnerability is often very high at that local level. So there are those responses that are needed at the farm level, and but without discounting that, what we really need, and what Charlene's initial slides have really sort of showed, is we need collaborative action that is across the value chain. No action at a particular stakeholder or an actor level is going to be commensurate with the challenge that we are facing. So without discounting what's needed at the farm level, when we think about some of these responses, and we examine some of these responses in the breakout group, I think it will be really helpful to think about what does that action mean, and does that really transform the value chain, or does it just sort of provide band-aids to particular actor groups, or works just at a particular level? Uh, so I think that's what I sort of wanted to share in terms of the responses that have emerged, and I will come back in terms of some of the potential interventions or collaborative actions that we are suggesting. But let me hand it over back to Charlene now.
Thanks, Deval, and also thanks to Deval and the few people that I saw just joined. So I think just as a kind of a rounding up of that section, we spent the last couple of years taking a deep dive into what the world might look like in not too distant a time, in a very different climate, and it's not an easy place to sit. It's not an easy place to think, not just what are some of the environmental changes that will be happening, but what is that going to mean for the lives of people trying to continue living, working, securing their livelihoods. And it's been both fascinating and heart-wrenching at times. And we've got a glimpse of what the challenges ahead are, that the future holds. And we've also got a glimpse of some of the things that we can do to make that future work better, and be more resilient, and also be just fit for the conditions of the future. So, as I mentioned, we wanted to start with an understanding of what good could look like, and then really work back from that to think about how we bring about that kind of regenerative and just cotton value chain. And I think really key as we think about climate adaptation responses is that we bear in mind that the current cotton system is already not fit for purpose in many ways. We know that there are a whole host of environmental challenges and social issues, issues with people being able to make a living wage, issues with you name it. I think everybody in this call is probably fairly well aware of the challenges with certain forms of cotton production. And what we're really needing to do is not to try to fix or tweak or band-aid parts of the system that are already not working, if we know that a system is already straining and showing its cracks, and that system is going to be in a context of increasing strain and stress. What we need is not to band-aid the current system, but to create a new one. So as we look at these different adaptation responses, the question I want us all to be asking ourselves is, how do we do this in a way that doesn't just prop up the old system or kind of make the old system less bad, but really enables a different kind of system to emerge that has outcomes that are designed as just and regenerative? So really look at it quite long and hard through that lens in what we're about to do. If we go to the next slide, please. We are about to break out into two groups, and we'll start with a brief introduction to the others in the group, and then think about how we might translate some of these ideas in reality. And one group will be led by me and the other by Deval, and you'll have a couple of our colleagues in each group who will be note-taking. And I'm aware that everybody here comes from a particular part of the value chain. We're going to ask you to show up, of course, with the hat that you normally wear, whether you're a brand or a standard or whatever, but also think about the whole value chain and what good might look like for the whole. Deval, can you talk us through the questions that we're going to be working with and the models that we're going to be diving deeper into?
Sure, Charlene. Thanks for that. So based on sort of the responses that I showed you just a while earlier, what we've tried to do is we've tried to group or pick out some of the responses that we really thought has the potential catalyze collaborative action, might be transformative, might be relevant across the value chain. So what we've done is we've picked 4 areas that we are putting on the table, so to say, today, and we want a discussion around that and really sort of move us towards whether it makes sense to pursue efforts in catalyzing action on these. So there are going to be 4 of these responses, as Charlene said, and each group will deal with 2 responses. So the first is largely around how do we support building best practices, adaptation responses, particularly for farmers and that part of the value chain. And the premise here is that with more climate information that's available, there is a risk that brands and traders may choose to move their sourcing areas from high risk to sort of areas which are going to face relatively lesser impacts of climate change. But this would be sort of a maladaptation response without considering without really sort of thinking about resilience from a long-term basis. So the first one, we want to look at how do we help build best practices to sort of really address the adaptation responses that are required and think it from a long-term perspective, particularly with respect to brands and retailers. The second is in terms of data and technology. And when we think about adaptation, climate adaptation, we sometimes think about technology as from a more technocratic lens. So we think about how could we improve inputs, how could we make sort of seeds more drought resilient, for example, or have fertilizers that really seep in quickly, or based on some weather changes that might be projected. As important as technology would be in those respects, what we want to focus here is how can technology and data support driving adaptation outcomes by restructuring power relations, and that's largely in terms of how information flows across various parts of the value chain, and can data be used in ways and collected in ways that serves all actors of the value chain sort of equitably without providing sort of unjust power or access to a few. The second group is going to look at one of the interventions that they're going to look at is around making a case for investment into climate adaptation. And the premise here is that while the case for sustainable cotton from an impact perspective is clear, we still find that investment into climate adaptation is somewhat sluggish. And what we've heard is perhaps there's a need for a more provable and demonstrable business case for investment into climate adaptation. So this group and this intervention looks at how do we really make a case for investment into adaptation. And the fourth is around we've been looking at the role of farmers in the cotton system until now as mostly producing the commodity that's cotton. Is there a case where we transform and expand the role of farmers from just producing cotton to producing a range of ecosystem services? So through regenerative agriculture that helps them adapt to climate change, but that which comes at a cost, can farmers be also financially incentivized for the various ecosystem services that they might produce as a result? So for example, improve water availability in a landscape. So this pilot would look at whether it makes sense for us to think about how do we transform the role of farmers from cotton production to sort of a range of services, and sort of help climate adaptation as improve resilience to climate as we do that. So those are the 4 interventions or sort of potential actions that we are going to look at into the breakout groups. And Charlene, if there's any other guidance that you want to provide to people before we break out.
Well, I'd just like to say, we know that you're not experts in these fields, or some of you may be, but most of you will not be. So we're not asking you, to be experts in the business case for investment or using data. We're wanting you to kind of use your perspective of somebody working in the cotton sector to think about how this might work. So don't feel shy to contribute ideas. Any ideas are good ideas. Don't feel you need to know the answer, because none of us do. That's why we're here trying to figure it out. And we're going to break you randomly into groups. And please just do pitch in and brainstorm with us so that we can come up with an idea of what the most important thing is that needs to be done and where to start. So we will have about, I think, 50 minutes, is that right, Neil, for this exercise? And then we'll come back in plenary.
Yep.
We'll see you on the other side.
Okay. Considering this is a small enough group, I was wondering if we could quickly just sort of introduce ourselves and the role that we have, and then I can provide a quick guidance in terms of how we're thinking about structuring this exercise, and then we can go about it. So yeah, I mean, if you could just do a quick introduction, start with myself. Dhaval Nigandhi, I'm the Associate Director for Climate at Forum for the Future.
I'm Fabio Carneiro. I'm from Abrapa. It's the Cotton Growers Association of Brazil, and I'm sustainability manager of the ABR certification here in Brazil, and we have the license of BCI with 50 hours sustainability.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, everyone. Follow up Fabio, as I'm from Brazil as well. My name is Fabiana Furlan. I am head of the sales and sustainability at Schaeffer. We are a cotton grower in Brazil, a family-owned company. And yeah, it's going to be a pleasure to collaborate with you today.
Wonderful, thanks.
Hey there, I guess I'll go next. Stephen Pierce, Sustainability Manager at Cotton Incorporated. Work on a lot of farm-related sustainability efforts, research projects, and otherwise to address climate and other issues in the cotton supply chain. Look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Stephen.
Hey guys, I'm Neil, change designer. Probably been bothering you with my emails. Nice to see everybody and look forward to the discussion as well.
Hi there, I'm Ulrika. I'm the communications lead for the Cotton 2040 initiative, and I work at Forum for the Future. So I'm mainly listening so I can get my head around what I'm going to be communicating over the rest of the year.
Thanks for joining, Ulrika.
And hi, I'm Kaylee. I work for Reese, a brand based in London. Sorry, I can't put my video on because I'm in the middle of an office. I don't have a private room. But we've just joined actually Cotton 2040 since September. So I'm just here to, yes, listen to new ways of working and new strategies that we could implement to ensure we're sourcing more responsible cotton.
Thanks for joining, Kelly.
I'm Lisa Ferguson. I've worked at a number of brands focused on manufacturing corporate social responsibility with a focus on labor rights, but I'm actually transitioning to a role with an apparel brand that will be focused on apparel supply chain traceability. So I'm eager to learn from all of you much more about the cotton space.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa. I guess everyone has gone and introduced. So let's get started. So if we would have the Miro board shortly. So we have about 50 minutes or so, and we have about 2 interventions. So I was suggesting that we spend about equal time on both of them, unless there's specific energy or preference to really sort of dive deep into one of them. So yeah, let me know if any of you have sort of preference for really choosing one and spending a lot of time. The way we're thinking of doing this is this is the intervention that you've sort of heard and the premise and the transition that we wish to advance through a collaborative action. What we want to do is start with thinking about some of the how might we questions, and the way the how might we questions can be articulated is what are some of the pathways that are needed for us to transition to this future that we are envisioning from where we are right now. So for example, if we think about the first pilot in terms of best practices on adaptation responses, or so to say, how do we avoid maladaptation? There could be number of pathways or how might we question, starting from how do we guarantee pricing against the cost of production to farmers? How might we guarantee fair pricing? Or how might we increase the agency of farmers in negotiating with brands? Or how might we encourage brands to take up long-term contracting? And there could be several others that we think it would be great for us to brainstorm ideas around. So we are basically looking at what are the pathways that will get us from where we are right now to the vision that we want. Based on this, or maybe just together with this, let's also start to think about what are some of the enablers that would help that pathway to sort of to advance the transition that is required. And then within the time that we might be left with, if there are specific things that we can think about within our own agency. So once we've thought about how might we questions and some of the enablers, if there are things that you might want to propose in terms of, as a brand, for example, this is something that you think you could do. And again, we would sort of need more discussion on this, but I think we would really appreciate if there are specific things that emerge out of it. So I would sort of just want to have the floor open now to hear some of these how might we questions, or the pathways that are really required for us to develop those best practices for adaptation responses, particularly with respect to brands and retailers. And let me know if there are any questions just about the process, if there are any.
Can you repeat the specific question? How might we, I think it was at the top there.
Yeah, we could go at the top, Neil. Yeah.
There we go.
So I think the vision there is, how do we avoid maladaptation practices? So in terms of moving the sourcing from areas that are going to be impacted or high risk to areas that sort of might not have that high risk, and the unintended impacts that might lead to. So how do we avoid that, or how do we build best practices in terms of building adaptation responses?
Yeah.
Does that clarify?
Yeah, for sure. I could start since I'm already talking. I think, one thing you can do is thinking about like an insetting project if you're looking at it from a climate change perspective, but those are opportunity areas, if you call it high risk, or they're doing quote unquote unsustainable practices. You go there, start a project. I mean, that's huge opportunity for change. If you think about the delta between the norm, what they're doing now, versus implementing some of these climate smart ag practices, I mean, that's a huge opportunity. And I think one way that we could kind of make sure we focus on that. Use that climate smart ag, maybe sort of carbon credit type approach in setting project to focus on some of these areas. I know, I mean, that's what we're coming at this from a high climate risk, correct? Just want to clarify that for everybody else.
Yeah.
Not like a labor sourcing, other issues. Clearly there's other high risk situations too, but we're talking about climate related risk, correct?
Yep.
Okay.
And again, I mean, now that you've sort of raised that, I just want to sort of highlight that moving sourcing areas might be driven by climate, but by other factors as well, and maybe climate might be interplaying into that. So maybe sometimes taking a systems view might be relevant and important. But yeah, I think we want to keep it to climate for now. Yes, Fabian.
Hi, everyone. Building on Steven's comment, I think it is something that it's important and relevant in this topic is for everyone in the chain build and work for more transparency. I think the more transparency we have along the supply chain, in the cotton industry, we have a very long supply chain. So we have growers, merchants, we have then the spinner, and then up to the brand. It's a long supply chain with so many companies involved. And I think definitely if we pursue a more transparent supply chain along with the partners that we have in our businesses, that would be something very beneficial for building this knowledge and asking for more responsibilities for everyone that is involved.
Yeah. And again, I don't want to sort of go back and forth, but if as you discuss these questions, if there are specific enablers that you can think of, feel free to mention it, or else we will go it in the next section. Hi, Fabio. Want to comment?
No, I would like to go through in a farmer level and talking about in a practice. I think it's really important to improve in all cotton sector. It's about the no-tillage plant. I think it's when you think in high yields, you think in tillage and more inputs and more all things we have doing, but no tillage plant we can improve lower costs using lower fuel use. I think it's the first thing. So I think adaptation technique of no tillage plant, it's a really true of all farm level, and we need to improve in all of farmers and in all countries. I think I would like to talk about the reduction of erosion and all the resilience in the cotton sector if we have climate change with lower water losses. And I think it's an environmental use because lower erosion and more carbon in the soil. We have poor soil in Cerrado, so we can improve carbon with no tillage plants. So another thing I would like to add, it's about the thinking with soil as a live organism. So you think the biological and all the improvements, so you have to lower costs if we input because we are looking the environmental with soil with that. So I think a really change technical, we need to improve more than we do now. It's a no tillage plant in the Brazil to break through the climate change issues we will have until next years.
Yeah, thanks for those interventions. Yeah, sorry, did anyone has that? Yeah, sorry if anyone had that. Anyone had an intervention. Fabio, if I could just sort of follow up on that, and I think that those are really important points in terms of soil health. if I could just sort of clarify what are, I mean, these interventions that are required at the farm level, what do you think needs to happen at the brands or the retailers level to really sort of advance some of these interventions at the farm level? Fabio, did you get my question? I just wanted to sort of follow up if based on sort of some of the interventions that you've suggested, some of the how might be questions around soil health, are there any particular actions that you see brands or retailers could take towards that end?
Yeah, I think brands can help in improving, like Steven said, I think in the first to improve examples of carbon credit, and so the no-tillage plant will be in that.
Right.
I think it comes down to actually caring. It's margin more than anything, making profit, and I think brands need to. I think even with the whole transparency side of things, if there was more transparency and you could link back to closer to the farmer level and have some form of relationship there, then I think it would be easier for CEOs and heads of to listen and actually want to make a change.
Interesting.
One thing that stuck out to me is this kind of incentive to create that change, other than that kind of social and environmental issue, which is, of course, you know, what we all care about and think about. But you know, is it a case of trying to change the focus away from, as you said, margin into more of a just changing the mindset entirely around away from just a purely economic argument? But how do we do that? How do we incentivize not just brands, but lots of different actors across the value chain into having that mindset?
Right, Neil. And I think it also comes with creating value, because all the companies, of course, they must make money in order to survive. So I think that's something important. But creating value around sustainability and around environmental responsibility is something that can drive profit, that can make it even more valuable for the brand. So the brands can build themselves in terms of brand reputation, and that has a lot of value. And for sure, it will have even more value in the future. So I think that's something that the brands can explore, building this kind of relationship that our friend just shared between the brand and the farmer directly. This is something very innovative, and ourselves at Sheffer, we are engaging with some collaborations with some brands, and it's very new and has a lot of challenges, because we need to build all these stories within the whole supply chain. But that's definitely something that creates value for the players that are engaged.
Yeah, I think that the range of issues there in terms of the mindsets around profits and reputation. But yeah,
I like to build. I was going to build on the price to value sort of paradigm. I think, you know, somewhere where brands could help would be, you know, understanding this intrinsic value of a more sustainable production system, or, you know, way of growing a fiber. And I mean, just an example, you know, cover crops and no-till, which, you know, Fabio kind of referenced, you know, that costs money for the grower. It's pretty easy for us to sit here and say, yeah, you should do cover crops and no-till, but I mean, that's significantly more crop management effort. You know, you save money on no-tilling, but then, you know, the seeds that are required to grow cover crops, I've heard somewhere around $30 an acre. So say you have 2,500 acres, which a lot of these guys and gals do, that's $75,000 in addition to time to plant cover crops and manage them. So I mean, there's got to be some additional way that, you know, we know that the brands are getting value from that story, but how can we share some of that value with the producer? You know, of course, his soil health is going to go up and increase. He will have benefits. She will have benefits eventually, but I mean, there's got to be some way that they can break into that. And I do think the carbon credit's one way to do it, but there's other examples of that too. So.
Yeah.
What role do consumers play in this kind of story? Like how do they fit into this? Because there has to be a pressure from that perspective as well. I mean, we're talking about value to brands. You know, if that's their if their entire raison d'etre is the consumer, you know, how can they potentially, how can that group potentially play a role in this?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of what the conversation I've heard over the years is consumers aren't willing to pay more. Consumers aren't willing to pay more. I think that that's shifting. I mean, we've seen new studies from like Harvard Business Review showing that this sentiment is changing, and this younger generation is more conscious about sustainability and climate change. And I mean, I'm personally willing to pay more, you know, $5 more for a shirt that's produced more sustainably. I mean, that's nothing. I think most people want that. So I think consumers could definitely play in some of that cost sharing, and I think they'd be happy to, at least the younger generations I can speak for. So, and then like my children's generation, I just think it's going to be more of an issue. So they'll be willing to pay more too. But I do think, you know, you can't put it all on the consumer. Some sort of reasonable sharing needs to take place, I think.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked a lot, or at least in some deal, about retailers and farmers and consumers as well. Wondering if there is a role here for financial institutions and investors as well as government. Is there anything that we see here that they might be able to do?
Yes. I think I brought this up in one of our previous discussions, but you know, there's the Climate Smart Ag bill that's out there from USDA. I think they're setting aside $3 billion or something like that. It might not all go to ag, but to kind of support this Climate Smart Ag sort of approach, and basically to catalyze a movement towards adopting some of these more sustainable practices. So I think that's one way governments could play. I mean, that's a lot of money. It doesn't have to be that much, but you know, anything to, you know, take on some of that cost, reduce the risk for the producers so they can try it out. And then at some point, you know, they'll start seeing the value of soil health and water, increase water infiltration, holding capacity, those things that Fabio is kind of talking about. So I think that's one way to do it, for sure.
Yeah.
Daval, just building on Stephen, it's easier to explore the positive contribution from the governments in developed countries such as US, that is very well organized, has by far the largest credibility in terms of information, public information, and things that it's very unique from the US. I think the challenge is really in the developing countries, that we do have large areas of planting cotton, such as the subcontinent of Africa, Asia overall, India. In these lower regulated countries and these developing countries, I think that's where the big challenges are. And I'm not sure if the governments are actually able to collaborate in a very strong way with the private sector. So I personally believe that it's very complicated as to generalize. So every region has a very strong particular situation in terms of climate, in terms of soil and practices conditions, in terms of farming, in terms of social. I don't believe that there are regions that are similar to each other, just to put in just one basket. So I think that it's very relevant to take that in consideration, that there are so many differences on if we compare the regions that are the cotton is grown.
Yeah, no, absolutely fair point. And sort of, yeah.
And I think in those regions, it's even the brands play even a larger role, a more important role, because it's where the help is most needed. So like vulnerable communities, regions that has suffering with climate. So I think that's even more relevant. And then I bring back the topic of transparency. The large brands, the textile in the textile industry, the large retailers, it is important for them to take this responsibility and bring transparency throughout the supply chain.
Yeah.
There was a really interesting point made in this morning session around somebody giving the exact same perspective that you were just talking about, Fabiana, about kind of if cotton sourcing shifted, and the hypothetical was in sub-Saharan Africa and it left one country and went to, say, like Mozambique, and why, what structure is there in place or lack thereof for Mozambique to, as an example, to look at that company moving their sourcing or moving to Mozambique and actually understand the reasons why they left the previous sourcing and understand who this company is and what risks are attached. It was a really interesting point, and I think you're really right to raise it in terms of the difference between the kind of well-regulated, developed countries, I guess, and the emerging economies in places like sub-Saharan Africa. It's a really key point for me.
Yeah,
I agree. That's super good insight there. Great point.
Okay, let's move to the other part of this sort of intervention. We have about 4 or 5 minutes I think we could spend on this. So I think we've got some of the enablers within those how might we questions, but I mean, if you could maybe each talk about some of the how might we questions that you had, or the transition that you said you really would like to see. If there are specific enablers you could highlight, I think that would be really useful. And Lisa, I really wanted to sort of call you out if there's anything particularly you wanted to share.
I guess I'm also just thinking about a really big picture, right? We're talking about what consumers can do, but also what brands can do. And I think, and also how, I think someone's mentioned, how do we transform what value looks like to a brand? And so that begs the question about demand. And do we need to have as much demand? Do we need to have more of everything all the time? And, what part of this big value chain, we're talking a lot about the farmer level, which is really important because that's always going to need to exist. But in the middle of the supply chain, processing and spinning, how do you all see the role of repurposed, upcycled, circular materials to be able to transform this space?
Yeah, really important point.
Lisa, speaking from the Brazilian side, I think the circular concept, it's still a very much theory because we're not able to recycle it, and we don't have technology nor infrastructure to recycle. So I think that's for sure something to be developed, but I don't think that's a solution for a problem as at the moment. So yeah, I think most of the countries need to do a lot in terms of building these capacity to actually make it work. That's the experience that I have here, at least.
Yeah, I mean, there were several points around transparency, building transparency within the supply chain. Are there any specific enablers that anyone can point out that really sort of are missing it right now?
Blockchain technology. Just being able to kind of increase traceability by utilizing things like secure blockchain. is something that's really interesting and it's been raised a few times across these roundtables.
And technologies also to make possible to measure carbon, as Steven said a couple of times, there is a market around carbon that can create value to compensate the growers and who is engaged in these investments in the supply chain. But yeah, definitely monitoring technology and accuracy systems as well, because that can bring more secure data for everyone that is engaged.
Yeah. Apart from, and I want to sort of stress that point, because payments for spreading the risk has sort of come about several times. Apart from technology, are there any other enablers that you guys see in terms of building capacity at various levels or anything else?
I think, just any level of data record keeping for your farm is beneficial for transparency. It doesn't necessarily have to be in some blockchain system. Thinking about some of these smaller holder farms, I mean, even just the dates of planting and cover crops applications that you didn't till, just kind of having a clear record of all of your best management practices. I think doing that now and having that on hand will be beneficial in the future. And that's kind of what some of these, the climate smart ag carbon credit framework, that is definitely more leveraging of technology. But at the end of the day, all they're doing is documenting practices, transparency, to your point, Fabiana, and just being able to show what you're doing and prove it, I think, is key. So there's one side of it, using technology and models to maybe prove the environmental benefits of doing things, but we know that planting cover crops and no-tilling has a benefit. So if you're documenting at least that historically through time, you can perhaps enter into this marketplace at some point as well, and I think will be useful for the whole industry.
Yeah.
For me also, it's about suppliers that we're sourcing from being willing to share information and tell us where the cotton is coming from, because I find personally in my job that I just hit a brick wall every time when I try and delve deeper. I can't get past the yarn supplier, and that's what I find hard to even know where to start. Who would I contact to help me with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's tough sometimes, knowing, visiting some of these spinning mills where they have literally 90 bales of cotton from all over the world in order to meet a yarn specification for a brand. So, cotton's purchased on quality to meet a certain end product. So it's sometimes hard to just say, oh, I'm going to source from just this region, because it might not fill the quality requirements of a particular product. So, I mean, that is something that I think, as we move down this road of traceability, transparency, more sustainable, whatever you want to call it, the quality comes into play. At the end of the day, you need a product that is going to be sold, and how do you meet the specifications of that with a limited quantity of materials? I think it's just another challenge we have to deal with.
Yeah, that's an important point, Stephen. Thanks for raising. So I think, let's just take the last part of this in the next couple of minutes, without putting any one of you on spot. If there are actions that any of you could take as the actor, sort of as the actor group that you represent, or any other actor group that you think, if there are specific actions that sort of come to your mind based on some of these how might we questions or the enablers, I think it would be good to grab that again without putting any of you on spot. Yeah, just take maybe half a minute if there's anything that you can think about, else we'll move to the next one.
We, at Cotton Incorporated, we represent the growers. That's what our board is mostly comprised of. So for us, just trying to create framework sustainability programs, basically, that document and provide transparency and show continuous improvement and track progress through time. So for us, any program that does that and kind of help show what the progress is being made, I think the better. So that's kind of where we stand on it.
Thanks.
I think there's, one of the things that some brands do really well, and kind of more brands could do as well, is just kind of be a leader in the field and kind of put their best foot forward. And I think there's sometimes, we've heard, that there's sometimes a bit of a fear about being the first mover sometimes to make radical change, because it might end up, hitting your margin first, even though it might help in the future. So not to say that people aren't doing this, but sometimes I guess brands do need to make that kind of leap, if you like, and take a chance and be a leader in the field. Just my perspective.
I think going back to what you all were saying earlier, it's also about incentivizing that transparency. So if there's a way that brands can incentivize suppliers in the middle of the supply chain to come forward, because I think, historically, at least at the manufacturing level, it's been very much like a policing kind of relationship. What are we going to find? And so I think if we can change that narrative to focus on how are we going to partner together and invest in those regenerative practices, then that can be much more powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Okay.
It's easy for a spinning mill to just say, oh, there's 90 different bales from around the world, so we can't tell you. But I mean, at the end of the day, I think they know. And with transparency, maybe it requires some sort of incentive to get there. Interesting.
Great. I want to keep the discussion moving. So if there's any other action that comes to your mind, feel free to put that in chat. But let's just take the second potential intervention as well and spend some time on that. So I don't know if anyone wants me to sort of clarify that again, but it's basically looking at the using technology and data beyond just the technocratic solutions, and more in terms of information, and how does that help in restructuring power relations and use data and information more equitably across the value chain. So some of the how might we questions that one can think about, Nate, if you could go down, is around building digital literacy among farmers, for example, or using data and information to reduce the gap among consumers and producers. Some of it I know we've discussed in the earlier ones as well, particularly around transparency, and how do we use digital solutions to facilitate that. Some of the things that sort of came up in the earlier roundtables, just to get discussion started, was as we think about data and technology, how do we think about some of the issues that come in terms of differential access, be it in terms of gender, be it in terms of economic groups. So that's also something that we could think about. So yeah, any ideas around what kind of pathways we could take to use technology and data to improve resilience around with respect to climate? I mean, I'm mindful some of it we've already discussed in the first one, but I think here we are looking more specifically in terms of data and technology, right? So just if any of you are wondering about the differences.
You could use, like a yield map overlaid with your field that would highlight underperforming regions. Is there something else you could do with those? Could you plant something else there to, maybe take it out of production, go and plant wildlife habitat or something like that? Maybe. I mean, if you continually get no yield or pretty much limited yield off a particular region of the field, what else could you be doing there? Maybe it's better suited for a different crop. I don't know. I mean, so you could use some of this ag data, precision ag data to look at that. But I guess my fear with this question is some of these smallholder farms. I mean, they don't have access to any of this anyways. So
Yep.
how do you do it in a way that, how might we establish something that could work for those stakeholders as well? I don't have the answer to that, but
Yep. That's an
because I
important
mean, it's
point.
important too to help them get the same insights. I'm not sure how they would do it.
Yeah. I think I mean, we're particularly looking at some of these questions precisely, Stephen. So how do we make the best use of it, and what are some of the big transitions that are required? So that's a good question like that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that always stands out to me when thinking about this kind of data and technology question is how to make it actually useful for farmers. And often a lot of solutions are solutions looking for a problem and not kind of building from the problem first. So it's kind of like, oh, we have a great mobile application, and then we'll just give it to a farmer, and then the farmer's like, cool, you know, great. I guess this is going to not change my life at all. And so it's, you know, how do we create? For me, it's like, how do we create kind of solutions actually built out of the lived experience of not just farmers, but kind of everybody in the supply chain. People have talked about processes. I think that's super critical. They're kind of seemingly quite an invisible part of this process, you know, or traders, or it's all these, you know, it's all these different actors who seem to kind of be skipped when we're talking about technology. So, or just data. And there's a key part of this that Noah mentioned in terms of how the data gets to them, you know, and is used equitably in order to improve power dynamics. So I think there's really, yeah, for me, it's just kind of trying to think about not just forcing solutions that we think are good down farmers or other people's, you know, throats, but actually kind of creating things that work for people in a meaningful way.
And Neil, it's not only creating that people actually will use, but look, as you mentioned before, Mozambique. I was talking to Giner there, and the challenge there is actually having the people an identity formally. So I think, you know, the discrepancies between one region and the other is so huge that it's really hard to talk about, you know, the technology stage. We cannot compare the technology stage that the US and Brazil has as a big growing region of cotton, comparing to India, China, and Africa, for example. It's completely two different worlds. So in our case, for example, Brazil, even Australia and US, we are very advanced in terms of technology. Then fortunately, we already use it, and there is room for many more improvements for sure. But in the other regions, we just need the basics and the basics data with accuracy and assurance as well.
Yeah,
I like that. Again, it depends on the region of how you approach this problem. I think anything you can do to be more efficient with your inputs, specifically thinking about the example of nitrogen and fertilizer, knowing, you know, both the embodied energy in fertilizer and field emissions of N2O, those both sum together to contribute about 64% of global warming potential for the cotton production side of the supply chain. So if you can do, you know, use technology to help make better choices on your fertilizer application, so improve nitrogen use efficiency, I think this has huge consequences and benefits towards climate change. I did the math on this for something we're doing recently, like an animation and a fact sheet we're doing, but if you're 20% more efficient with fertilizer applications across the entire cotton production supply chain, that's about 5 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents that are just abated per year. So I mean, this is a huge number, and And 20%, I'm not, not even sure if that's feasible, but that's just kind of my back of the napkin talking with some of our ag experts. Like, well, yeah, maybe we can get there. I mean, so if we get the entire across the global cotton supply chain, everyone who makes cotton 20% more, 5 million metric tons CO2 equivalents a year. So
Yeah.
let's try to do that.
Yeah.
Somehow
Again,
technology. I mean, I know in the US you can take, soil samples and know exactly what fertilizer requirements are in your field and then do precision application. So, I mean, there are technologies that exist, but to Fabiana's point, in the more technology kind of focused sides, North America, if you will, Australia. So we have a way to do that in some parts of the world and others. So I think we got opportunity here.
Yeah. I mean, a classical example of how mitigation and adaptation both could be advanced and could be synergistic. So I think that's a great example. Something that I sort of quickly wanted to seek inputs again is in this question, we are looking at the role of technology or data in terms of equitably distributing power across the value chain. So I mean, if there are questions that you have in your mind around even concerns of how technology could be negatively used to exacerbate some of the power relations, I think those would be good to capture as well. So as I think someone mentioned around maybe some of the powerful actors might end up using the improved or increased technology to build even more power. So if there are questions that you have in your mind, I'd love to hear that as well.
I mean, the real blue sky thinking for me on this would be, a brand is saying X, a sourcing partner is saying Y, and then suddenly if farmers have the data in the agency to be able to say, actually, they're keeping we're part of their story, but what they're saying isn't true, and here's how we can back that up. And this is probably a wider point than just the data, but there would be something there around kind of having a level of information available to you as a farming organization or association or even individual who can say, we've talked already about kind of providing stories, and that will allow people to create value. But where are the farmers in that story? Well, they're central to it. So how can they sit there and say either what they're saying is right or wrong? But that's, I don't know, it's kind of my blue sky thinking about how we can change the power dynamics within this so that accountability is not just coming from the consumer or from the brand, but it's also coming from the farmer who can say, you don't get to tell my story without me.
Yeah, good point. Really good point, Lee. Anything else that anyone can think about? We've covered some of it in the first one, so I'm fine if there are limited things that one can think about. Are there any specific enablers that for some of the questions that we've thought about in terms of creating solutions that really come from, say, the users, or ensuring that the technology doesn't have, but it just doesn't exacerbate some of the existing power dynamics? Are there any specific enablers that you can think about? I mean, in the first roundtable, for example, there was a lot of discussions around biases and how the way we design applications sometimes has the inherent bias of who is designing it and some of the sort of power relations or assumptions that come with that. So if there's anything like that you can think about, I think it would be good to capture.
I think the existing cotton sustainability programs out there and ones to come enable, the increased transparency and data leveraging. I'm not sure if that's exactly what this is getting at, but every kind of a key aspect of all those programs is data and transparency, you know. So I think promoting, joining in some of those programs from the grower side will help this, you know, enable this, I believe.
And just to put some thinking going, I think one of the things that again was raised earlier was thinking about data again to enable that systems change to happen. So we're not just thinking about data in terms of for the farmers, which are the best markets, but if I have to shift to regenerative agriculture, these are the kinds of crops or seeds or inputs that are available, where these are available, what are the kind of practices that I need to take, and stuff like that. So how do we use data to again enable that shift towards looking at it from an entire systems perspective? I think again was highlighted, and I wonder if there's anything related to that you feel is important.
What about from the investor level, knowing, you know, if you're doing X, Y, and Z sustainable practices, then you get a better interest rate on your loan or something like that. I mean, I don't know how those details usually work, but I think these things are happening in other aspects of sustainability. You have to prove you have climate resiliency built in before you even get a loan, you know, to finance part of your operation or brand or that sort of thing. So
yeah, you're right.
We've also talked about this too from the farm insurance perspective. I'm not sure, I don't know much about it in other countries how that works, but in the US we have farm insurance, and perhaps could you give them a better rate if they're doing more sustainable climate resiliency type practices? That could be another angle.
Absolutely. Using data to further incentivize some of the regenerative or adaptation interventions that are needed. That's a really good point. Anything else here into our sort of last few minutes? So if there's anything else in terms of enablers, I mean, there's also the section again around what you could do as the actor group that you represent, or any other actor groups that you represent. But again, I think if something comes to your mind, I think it would be great to hear. But otherwise, I would love to sort of populate as many enablers that we can think about, because that would really help us think about some of the interventions.
I think definitely collaboration and collaboration between companies and brands, investors, producers that do see value in this process going forward. That's something that can build strength in this movement. So I think, yeah, the collaboration between brands and companies can contribute.
Right. And are there any specific enablers sort of that you have noticed or you've come across in terms of what really enables that collaboration to happen?
Sorry, I didn't understand you.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm just wondering, because you've highlighted collaboration as important, are there any specific enabling factors for that collaboration to really happen, where in terms of, yeah, maybe there are whatever one can think about? Sorry if I've sort of not articulated it well enough, but I'm just wondering if there are any specific factors that you think would really drive collaboration that you're suggesting.
So I think definitely in market collaboration, in you selecting your partners, your suppliers, your clients. So it's actually choosing the right companies, and it's not only driven about price here. Then I think companies should look at as an investment in this kind of businesses.
Yeah, that's fair. the other thing that I sort of want to again bring about, and this was something that we heard a lot in the earlier roundtable, was around sort of the power of information, but also the negative impacts misinformation could have. So if there's anything that you've come across, or either in terms of enablers or something that we should be thinking about in terms of misinformation.
That's a very critical topic.
Yeah. Anything you want to sort of add here, Fabiana, just for us to understand the context better?
Sorry, Deval, the internet broke here.
Yeah, I mean, if there are any specific examples of or things that might help us think about the context better in terms of misinformation, I think that would be super helpful. If there's anything you want to add.
Yeah, I think there are so many misleading information about cotton out there, that having more true facts, I think it can be very beneficial for everyone in the chain. But there are so many untrue facts that are being spoken by organizations, brands, claims about sustainability. So I think, yeah, that's definitely a topic that can be improved overall in our cotton industry. I can give you an example. For example, there are statements that saying that organic cotton consumes less water than conventional cotton. That's a completely lie. So, things like that. So this kind of misinformation can be very negative to the sector overall.
I dropped a link to a report in the chat. Everybody check it out. It's very good. Well done by the Transformers Foundation on this very topic. They dig into that one you just brought up and many others. So we all need to, we all need to look at that and align on it, in my opinion.
Thanks,
Steven. It's a great one.
Yeah, I'm sure you read it. I think I've plugged it a couple of different times, and yeah, you might have.
Welcome back to the plenary. We had a really good conversation in our group, and I hope you did in Daval's group. Daval, can I ask you to just summarize some of the nuggets that came out of your conversation about what we might actually do?
Wow. Yeah, I think super rich discussion, and I will share some of the points that sort of came through. But yeah, anyone else in my group, if there are things that I've missed that are really significant, feel free to jump in. So on the first one, which was around how do we advance some of the best practices among brands and retailers and traders on adaptation responses, I think some of the things that were highlighted was this is a case of how do we spread the risk more evenly. So the question that we are really thinking about is sort of spreading this risk. Transparency was highlighted as sort of one of the key elements that we need to move and think about. We highlighted some of the areas of opportunity when we think about adaptation, and how could brands, retailers, traders use that to within high risk areas to really see them as opportunities, for example, in terms of mitigation benefits from carbon credits and the co-benefits it might have for adaptation. There were sort of very clear things that were brought out in terms of thinking about the price to value paradigm here, and the intrinsic value that will be generated from these responses, and how do we share the value of that value more equitably is an important question for us to think about as we think about that transition. We also highlighted some of the roles that regulators and governments might be able to play, but again, it sort of depends on country to country, and particularly in developing countries, we highlighted that capacity might be a challenge. So yeah, I think there were several interesting how might be areas that we identified on the first one. some of the enabling factors that that we thought were some around technology and how could technology support transparency and facilitate that shift to happen, around circularity and how circularity could again sort of enable that and reduce the cost and the bottom line concerns that brands might have. There were several points around again using technology, but technology to monitor stuff on ground, be it in terms of benefits from regenerative practices, or in terms of the risks or impacts that might be happening at the farm level. And in terms of some of the actions that we could take, I think we sort of stopped short of that because of the time, but there were around how could we take more actions around building transparency with suppliers if we're thinking about brands or around sorry, I'm just losing that in terms of how do we incentivize partners to sort of increase that transparency. So there was stuff around transparency that emerged as some of the action points. In terms of the use of technology and data to help adapt to climate change, I think there were again several interesting insights. Some of the important ones were how might we be able to use some of the lived experiences among farmers and among different parts of the value chain to create solutions rather than enforce already developed solutions. So really sort of building technology from the bottom up. There were also points around using technology to ensure we don't exacerbate some of the power relations. So how do we bridge gaps with respect to access as we try and use technology to adapt to climate change? Again, there were several in terms of use of technology from a more technocratic perspective in terms of precision agriculture or using fertilizers efficiently and those sort of aspects. In terms of some of the enablers that we could think about was around digital literacy, around how could insurance products be developed that use the data and provide better value for the insurance products while also advancing some of the adaptation outcomes that we are seeking. There were also suggestions in terms of using the data to provide financial incentives to enable that shift towards a more resilient cotton sector. So, for example, there could be financial incentives linked to some of the practices that different actors might be involved in to increase resilience. There were also sort of points around how do we help reduce misinformation while also leveraging the power of information, and just using data and technology to facilitate collaboration between different actors, which sort of we've highlighted is one of the important key elements to improve resilience. So yeah, I will stop there, and anyone in my group, there's so many interesting points. If there's anything that you want to particularly add, feel free to chip in here. Okay, I guess I've done a good enough job, or I might have confused things. But yeah, that's where we were.
Okay, I'll be brief because I know there is such a thing as death by feedback for a group that you weren't in. But I'll try to just highlight the things that stood out for me. And please, group, do chip in. So we started with the question of how do you enable the increase of ecosystem services and really helped farmers transform their role from just growers of cotton to ecosystem services providers? What would need to happen for that to really take off? And I think the couple of things that really stood out and that different themes coalesced around is firstly just really clarifying what regenerative agriculture is. And, you know, can you benchmark that and just clarify that for all the actors across the value chain? And that would create a certain baseline that that could be built on. And then the other thing is around data and verification, that this requires a really strong way of proving that the ecosystem service has actually been provided. And you know, there is a possibility of cheating, I suppose, or of people trying to get in on the market without actually doing the real stewardship of the land. So how do we make sure that this is really robust? And that was a really key theme across a few different points. And then the third point was around providing, you know, training and capacity building for farmers, whether that's you know, a kind of straightforward training or regional support services where farmers support each other. And then thinking about what would enable this to happen. One was a really clear baseline and definition of what it means to take cotton beyond conventional to organic, regenerative, and beyond. Legislation, regulation, stuff that penalizes the bad and incentivizes the good, in Kelly Pepper's famous words. Having things like demo plots that farmers can learn from was really seen as important. And sector and brand commitment, communicating the demand for regenerative cotton to really help drive that uptake. So there was, you know, there was a lot more, but I think those are the things that really stood out. And the key enabler was of course money. But, you know, the question is, how do you incentivize that flow of money? So those were the key things for enabling that changing role of the farmer to provide ecosystem services. And then really linked to that is this other point about, well, how do you make the case for investment into climate adaptation? How do you get investors of all kinds to finance this? And we did quite a bit of head scratching around that because that's a really tough ask. So we had lots of questions about, well, how do you communicate the value of cotton and its carbon footprint? How do you educate financial service providers about the needs within the value chain? How do you maybe finance the shift to more resilient crop types and establish a business case for that? How might we enable terms or build financial terms which enable farms and brand supply and shared risk? So we had a lot of things that we thought would be important to do. When we got to, well, what would actually enable that? We had just a few points. One of them is this point about developing transparency and connectivity. Really clear data, very strong verification platforms, and also, simple things like long-term contracting, which in many cases are just not in place. So, changes in the way those sourcing commitments are made around ecosystem services. Having direct relationships between brands and farmers, so that the funding can come from the brand of the farmer. And another thing we talked about was, for example, having a focus group to ask ESG and other investors what they would need to flow finance towards climate adaptation. And we realized, or I realized, this was a kind of a light bulb moment for me, that we've done a lot of kind of thinking and banging our heads against how we make the business case to investors. And it occurred to me that, well, if you want to answer a question, you ask the kind of person who knows the answer. So why don't we convene a focus group of investors and really ask them what they would need to be in a business case for these different forms of climate adaptation in cotton, and then build an approach around that. So that's certainly one I'm going to take away. So that's a snapshot. let's go, we're coming into the finish. Let's go to, we're going to do a little Menti exercise. And this is really just to get a pulse check. We know that these are huge issues. And if you were going to do an analysis of them in a really thorough way, it would take a very different approach. But we just want to get a kind of a reading of where you see these approaches as being, firstly, feasible, as in, you could implement them. They're doable. We've kind of got the essential components to implement. The second rating is, what would be the impact across the value chain? Do you think it would be a really high impact across the value chain or not? And really critically, what's the potential for each of these 4 areas to be transformative? So what we're going to ask you to do is to, in a minute, we'll show you a Menti code. And if you scan it with your phone or follow the link that Neil has just put in the chat, you'll be taken through these 4 questions. And we'll just take 5 minutes for everybody to answer the questions. We should have got some like mood music, but we didn't. and for you to answer your to the question, as much as you can, and it may be your gut feeling, but really thinking about those 3 questions around feasibility, impact, and transformative potential. And then we'll just look at what comes back for you, and that will help guide us into thinking about what are the pilots that we're going to recommend to the sector to take forward. So if you follow the code or the link, and we'll take a few minutes to answer the questions. And Fabian points out, the questions will have different answers according to different growing regions. You're absolutely right. If you want to put any comments in the chat about that, please do, and we'll capture those too.
Can you clarify best practice adaptation responses? What exactly? You probably did, but I might have got confused.
Okay, this is really important. If you will have each been in a group that dealt with 2, and if you weren't in that particular group, then you might not be familiar with it. Deval, do you want to quickly characterize best practice adaptation responses?
Sure. The idea there is that there is a risk that certain responses that might be taken by, say, brands or retailers might be examples of maladaptation, where it is implemented with the best intention, but it doesn't really help adapt to climate change. So the idea there is, can we help build best practice adaptation responses, particularly from brands, retailers, traders, that support downstream partners? Hopefully that clarifies it enough for you to answer that question.
And in the Menti, what we're asking is, say for pilot 1, we're saying that this would be an approach that would be feasible. And do you agree with that, or do you disagree? Or or if you don't really know, then you might be somewhere in the middle. And Neil, perhaps you can put a message in the chat when you see that we've got a certain number of responses. How are we doing, Neil?
Still just a little bit of time.
Okay. Okay, and just a last minute, and then we'll look at the results.
Just waiting for the final results from the last pilot coming in.
Okay, okay, great. So, Neil, when that comes in, if you can share your screen, and we'll have a look. Okay, so this is interesting. So, according to this, building best practice adaptation responses is pretty feasible, seen on the feasible side, having pretty strong impact and ranking fairly highly on the transformative end. Okay, let's look at the next one. All right, this one is further using technology and data to help adapt to climate change, having high impact and transformative potential. That's obviously a strong contender. Oh, this one is seen as a little bit less feasible, probably because we don't really know how we're going to do it, but has real potential to be transformative. I think this is my favorite. And the final one, transforming the role of farmers from cotton production to ecosystem services actors, seen as being feasible, perhaps more feasible than some of the others, and having quite high impact. So I guess my reading is the final two are perhaps have a little bit more sense of transformative potential around them. We'll take this away and think hard. But I've definitely got a bee in my bonnet about following up the idea about a focus group with investors, because I think we need to crack that. So this really brings us to our close, and I think, you know, I'm really preaching to the converted with this group. I'm well aware, but this is something that we in Forum are really focusing on as we go into 2022. You know, coming out of 2021. You know, this decade is the decade of delivery. That if we don't deliver sustainability outcomes this decade, it will in many cases be too late to stabilize the climate and ensure the health of the planet. So we need a radical transformation. And the question is it going to be deep and really transformational, or is it going to be shallow and kind of fixes to an existing system that won't be resilient or serve the purposes of the future? So it's really a crossroads. And we're we're really asking partners to work with us in areas, you know, where we can have greater potential by working together to reset ambition, to look beyond sustainability, to that really aspirational and stretching ambition for a just and regenerative future. We don't really use the word sustainability much anymore. And make sure that the transitions are done in such a way that they really tackle the problems that were already existing in supply chains, like structural inequality and environmental impacts, and really change the system while they're doing that. So that's really our ambition as we start looking at what these pilots might be, and we're really asking you to partner with us. If you're interested in piloting any of the approaches that we've begun to explore today, please be in touch and we'll work up an approach with you. Deval will say a little bit more about next steps in a moment. And please, continue to either work with, partner with us or learn with us, because we're really aware as we hold these adaptation conversations, these are new. And it's really hard for people to think about these things and to work out solutions. So I know you've been really working hard today. And it is hard because it's new and we're not used to doing this yet. But it's something that we need increasingly to do. So our invitation is to partner with us, either to pilot and do something on the ground, or to continue working with us as a learning partner and sharing what we learn. Deval, you want to have a quick word about what comes next?
Thanks, Charlene. So yeah, so in terms of the immediate next steps, we are closing this phase of Cotton 2040, which was around sort of communicating and learning about the risks and the responses and potential interventions that are needed. So now we are going to reach out to some of you who have shared your interest in sort of being part of these conversations, continuing these conversations, and we will do that as we think about the couple of pilot interventions that we want to be engaged in. And again, these will be collaborative actions that really test and develop some of the approaches for which we've initiated discussions today, and that bring unusual actors together to really sort of bring transformative changes. So again, we would encourage you to sort of connect with us if you want to partner or learn with us as we go through that journey. For India, which we have a sort of a more focused work on at a national level, we are planning a kickoff meeting of civil society actors to join up action. So this is a different geography, but if any of you are interested in joining that meeting, although the time might be challenging, this will be sometime next month. Please get in touch with us. So yeah, I think I would love to close off and have the pleasure of closing this journey of roundtables, which has been absolutely amazing. So on both behalf of Forum for the Future and our partner, Willis Towers Watson, really want to thank all of you for being part of this journey and sharing such invaluable thoughts. We've learned a lot, and we've really found this process really useful, and we hope you found that equally useful as well. And we will hope to have you continue in this journey as we now think about collaborative action and move from theory to practice. So really hope to have you continue this journey with us, and until then, thank you again for being part of this learning process, and take care everyone until we talk again. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.